The Importance of Teaching Culture in Japanese English Classrooms, a mini cognitive case study by Dailyn Brown. My research question was, do Japanese teachers believe that culture should be embedded into their English classrooms? Why ask this question? This topic is important to me because I am interested in learning about other cultures myself. Part of my amoy is seeing from many cultural perspectives and learning other languages. It is a part of what brought me to teach ESL and ESOL. It is also a point of interest to me. After 9 years of teaching, I have worked with many Japanese students in San Diego, and I have noticed that though they are very competent and willing to learn and also excellent test takers, studiers, and have a deep understanding of grammar, actually more so than most native speakers, there is a disconnect when it comes to listening and speaking skills. There is also a lack of confidence and willingness to try, knowing that they will make mistakes. I want to understand what might be missing from their English education at home, and if that connects to these language deficits. Going to Japan allowed me to see actual classes and talk to a range of people about my question. The ideas presented here are not critical, but rather studying differences. There is no right answer. If I come across as generalizing or judging, it is not my intention. This is a small study. I'm just reflecting on what I've gathered in a short period of time. I was surprised that I wasn't able to find much research when doing my literature review on culture taught in Japanese English classes. But I also realized it's important to understand what is culture. Culture is the characteristics and knowledge of a particular group of people encompassing language, religion, cuisine, social habits, music, and arts. But if we go deeper, we can say that it's also shared patterns of behaviors and interactions and cognitive constructs and understanding that are learned by socialization. Dr. Inoue also stated that it could include belonging to a group that shares the same value system, norm, judgment criteria, lifestyle, activity, technology, and so on. In my research, I found that there were two main themes between all of the articles that I looked at. Some were using specific sources like TV shows to present and facilitate cultural literacy, while others were using same TV shows to focus more on very specific cultural components like speech acts. So I'm going to talk about two different ways that these things can be compared. I also noticed that the people doing this research were all living in Japan and working at universities, but the majority of them were actually not Japanese nationals, but people who had come from outside of Japan to work in Japan. So in my literature review, I saw that people were looking at the visible culture, but also the unseen or deeper culture, finding cultural competence and focusing on topics outside of just regular pop culture, and thinking about doing culturally responsive teaching. Rukinski wrote an article about improving cultural literacy by using The Simpsons. He felt that it could help communicate American culture to students by using thematic choices to make a more helpful, deeper connection to American culture, by looking at things like sex and gender issues, environmental issues, health and lifestyle, and many others. He quoted Krasner in saying, "It takes more than just linguistic competence to be proficient in a foreign language." He believed that this cultural competence had to do more with understanding daily living and etiquette, as well as cultural differences or pop culture. Hammond states that popular definition of culture only refers to the culture that's visible and easily discussed, but we have to also think beyond that, about sociocultural norms and worldviews, beliefs and assumptions and value systems that all are included and actually have to do with language teaching and learning as well. He feels that knowing this can actually help inform us when we're teaching a language and not just learning a language, and it's called culturally responsive teaching. Another way that sitcoms can be used would be to understand speech acts. So using the Big Bang Theory to help Japanese EFL learners work on pragmatic awareness. Understanding speech acts is different than just understanding culture because it has to do with students recognizing grammatically incorrect or pragmatically appropriate ways of speaking versus ones that are non-erroneous. This study proved that the instructor should find more of a balance between using grammar in the classroom and making sure that students actually understand the lacking of a language in well-balanced language competence. The final two articles that I'm going to compare have to do more with intercultural communication, which is in a way connected with other things as well, but two studies were done, one more recently than the other, having to do with communication rules, interjections, gift giving, proverbs, gender, education, as some examples. It's vital to be successful in communication by understanding these things, and so there was a curriculum that was developed over the course of 12 weeks where students were learning and comparing Japanese culture to American culture based on these standards. I had the opportunity to work with students from Waseda University as well as spend time in a town called Tokorozawa at the junior high school and elementary school. The people that participated in the study were students from these schools, as well as an assistant language teacher from the school district and the junior high school principal, as well as a professional development coordinator, and about 15 to 20 Japanese nationals that I was able to talk to throughout the time that I was in Japan. I chose to take field notes because I would have the opportunity to actually be at schools and with educators and students. I also chose to do informal interviews because I was going to be able to talk to many Japanese native speakers who grew up in the Japanese educational system. These were the methods that I used throughout my time. I decided to do these interviews in a very informal way without really making it apparent that I was actually interviewing people, but more discussing what I was doing for my research and asking a few casual questions. I thought this would promote less nervousness about using English in conversation, as well as not feeling formal, and the conversations happen more naturally in places like restaurants, bars, train stations, and also at the schools that we visited. Some example interview questions were like, what kinds of culture were brought into the English classroom, if any, please give examples, and how did this help your language learning experience? How do you feel about your English skills and why? What did you like or not like about your English classes? And what would you want more of in English classes for future students? Possible results that came from my work. Though my research was specific to culture, I realized that English in general isn't introduced until students are in 5th grade, and only once a week. In 2020, it will become mandatory in 3rd grade, mainly because of the Olympics and globalization and technology connecting the world. English classes are predominantly taught in Japanese. An example I have here shows a worksheet from an English class where students are actually answering questions in Japanese and not in English. In a more advanced English class, I noticed that the teacher was speaking English, but not very often, which surprised me. They did listen to a song in English, but maybe it was that day, but they did not spend a lot of time and didn't go through all the grammatical elements of the song or the vocabulary. They just sang along while listening. Taught through Japanese stories, Japanese curriculum is standardized and used nationwide. At the school district, they said learning another language through familiar topics is a kinder way to get students connected to the language. One of the English teachers I talked to said that she couldn't really speak English well. I also learned that at the moment there is a lack of experience in general with teaching English at the elementary school level. I spoke with some future English teachers that were studying at Waseda University, and they told me that they weren't good at speaking English, and most didn't even speak to me in English at all, but actually had someone else translating for them. This is very surprising to me. Most people I spoke with were unsatisfied with their English education and ability or lack thereof. They said that they couldn't speak well or understand English, though they had studied for many years. People I talked to also said that culture was not widely used frequently during classes because they were just quietly studying or listening to the teacher. But when they did remember music being played or an American game, they remembered it with fondness and wished that there had been more of that in their classes. They were critical of their learning process and culture of education in Japan in general. As I mentioned before, the same English textbooks are used throughout the country and incorporate Japanese culture because they believe students should be proud of their heritage and be able to talk about it in English. I also learned that learning more about your own culture helps you reflect on it when exploring others in their mind. The most interesting I learned while I was there was that an assistant language teacher is a cross-cultural advocate, and each school has a native speaker coming from any English-speaking country in the world, for example, the United States, Australia, Canada, England, Nigeria, to name a few. They're there to spice things up a bit and sometimes include music or poems or casual or more informal language into the classroom. But this is just a small component of the English class. The ALTs don't really teach as much as they are used more as a living resource and a fact checker, a grammar corrector, and a pronunciation specialist. ALTs can create an English board with some culture and customs and discuss this in class time, but they're never given freedom to actually be the main teacher. Why is this? I think I learned that there is a great concern to start teaching English too soon and not be good at Japanese or forget that native culture while learning about another. Raising children bilingually is a controversial topic at the moment, and maybe because there is a lack of diversity in the country, there's not really a need to actually learn another language, whereas in other countries it is important. One person I interviewed said that they work on kanji as well as hiragana and katakana throughout high school, and they need to be literate in all three to really actually be literate in reading in a language in general. I was fascinated by the concept of kotodama, or the word spirit. It really resonated with me because it has so much to do with culture. You need to deeply understand the meaning of a word to speak properly and to listen to people. And I found that in my interviews, people were afraid to learn a new language because they didn't want to crowd that idea. This is an example of how two words can mean a word, but then each individual symbol can actually have its own deeper meaning, just like the meaning of omoi. My analysis of results and educational implications that came from my study mainly has to go back to thinking about how each English culture is taught, especially having an ALT in the classroom. There is this great opportunity to use more authentic sources and a person themselves who can be there, if you can trust that person to come in and actually be the teacher, get away from the traditional way of teaching and allow students to work more in groups, have a more constructivistic way, and also to foster meaningful learning and do the group work with ALTs providing cultural cues. And also just having some fun in using the language, not just focusing on preparing for a test. Also, this fear of learning another language should be backed by more evidence. I don't think that it's too specific because studies do show that we learn quicker at younger ages, and it helps us develop confidence in our L2 and have less of a language ego that gets in the way. Older learners tend to be more hesitant. Also, the idea of emptiness of self, being ready to learn something new and throwing away that current you and arriving at a new one seems to be lacking. It seems that there is a fear of losing that old you. I think that maybe this has to do with the learning that's deeply implanted in the culture, and a shift needs to happen to change that, to open a new realm of duality of culture, not being a bad thing or looking at other styles of teaching English as a foreign language. Being afraid to lose something makes it hard to gain another thing. And so you're closed a little bit, and that's not a good way to learn a new language. This disconnect may be connected to kata, which encompasses a set of actions and movements in a practice that is culturally inherited to shape a certain mental tendency, discipline, disposition, and wisdom in the practice. So maybe it comes from the deep underlying feeling that everyone learns a certain way, and it's just a big part of the culture and the way that the culture learns in general. In reflecting, I must say that my experience was so amazing and meaningful to me to be in real schools and classrooms and have face-to-face conversations about my question with people who were having or had had firsthand experience with it. Also, to understand more about the way students are educated in Japan can fill some gaps for me when I have them in my class, so I can also be aware of cultural differences. The concept of fear of losing one's culture is so fascinating to me because I have always felt that it was an addition to my life to learn about another culture and learn a new language, not a subtraction. I also have always worked with students who left Japan to study in the United States, so I feel they had a different mindset. I wish I had more time to interact with the assistant language teacher to know more about how the student mindset is when teaching Japanese students in an English classroom in Japan. I had an aha or jikan moment when I thought about the question that I had asked originally. I was searching for answers that were very specific about cultural artifacts like TV shows, movies, and music, but it actually appeared to me that the way of teaching itself, the culture of that, learning of the first language, actually seemed to be gratefully impactful on Japanese English language learners, and that idea might need to be shifted before other things can be shared or learned. There is so much time spent crafting and understanding their own culture that there's not enough room for another. That's where the disconnect happens. It's not invited in on a national level. The heart's not open for it. But word spirits can exist on any level, and so it's important to be aware of that. This course in general was very interesting for me and made me think a lot about the way I learn and how that influences the way I teach. It has also given me more tools to help me continue to reflect on my practice as I am forever working on my takumi. I would like to thank everyone who helped me participate in this study. A special thanks to Dr. Molina and Dr. Inoue for being my academic heroes. Thank you.